So welcome to the bridge. My name's Athena. Now in the last video we were talking about how institutionalisation, especially in childhood, can cause our consciousness to go into hiding. And that can affect our connection with God. It can also affect our connection with other people. So we're picking that back up again in this particular video, and I've called it Playing Peekaboo with God. And I'm referring to the fact that we can come out of organised religion and not have any connection with God at all, even though we've grown up in an environment that is supposed to show us the way to get that connection and be in a relationship with God. So how does institutionalisation hamper a child's psychological development? And how does it create a sense of divine hiddenness from God? This is important to know if we are deconstructing and if we want to get free and if we want to develop a relationship with God, a tangible one in which we experience Him, and it's not by faith. So we're going to look at the damage that institutionalisation has on causing our consciousness to go to sleep, especially for those that grew up in the church, but also for those who grew up in abusive family, or even for those who may have spent their earliest years in child care centres. Now, some centres are very good, but some are very much not. So just a couple of nights back on Australian Broadcasting Channel, there was an investigative report into Australian childcare centres and the abuses that have been happening there, where profit is put before the welfare of the children in their care. And it's pervasive. High enrolment is a priority where there's not enough carers to look after the amount of children that they're designated, and educators actually can just buy their certification online. Now, in this video we're going to be looking at the absence of mother and father in the development of our consciousness. Institutionalisation at best restricts our free will, or at worst it totally removes it. Even if our childhood seems reasonable, even if we felt loved, our free will may have still been restricted. We may have grown up in a loving Christian family, but if God's rules were tightly enforced, even by the church, such as, for an example, no tattoos, no movies, no secular music or secular friends, regulated prayer times and Bible studies and constant church attendance with no breaks to do things like going camping, fishing or football games or play, that was not, organised by the church, or restricted and controlled play choices or controlled music choices. This is where we experience that institutionalisation, that lack of free will now, or the ability to exercise our free will. So what do I mean by free will? So when we are sentient, we take the qualia that our senses gather and we respond to them or interact with them through our consciousness. Our consciousness takes that which we receive through our hearing and tasting and smelling and whatever, and it interprets our experience. So qualia are the subjective and qualitative properties of experiences. So that which we experience or are conscious of. Now, if we cannot respond to our experiences because we have inadequate choices, then our free will is being restricted. Our choices are restricted. So, for example, if you think of a person who's been incarcerated, who has their choices almost completely taken away, you know, they eat when they're told, they eat only what is given, they exercise only when they're only allowed to talk to loved ones when they're given permission and not necessarily when they need to. Everything is heavily controlled. They can't even open a door unless permission has been given. Now, some religions are just like that. It might even seem, it might be more subtle, but the outworking of it can be as restrictive as that. And this is what I want to show you, that the removal of our free will can prevent us from making that tangible connection to God. There is direct effects of having our free will restricted and whether we form a tangible connection to God. When we live in an environment where we constantly feel unsafe or threatened, we can hide within ourselves in order to protect ourselves. Unfortunately, this sometimes is from an angry God. If we are forever thinking that God is going to punish us for the slightest infringements, then we can learn to hide from him. It's not necessarily a conscious decision. It's just a normal human self-protective measure. Think Adam and Eve after they ate from the tree of knowledge and good and evil. You know, they hid from God in amongst the trees. So what we're going to do now is to first look at some extreme incidences where institutionalisation has done psychological damage to babes and young children. So between 1956 and 1989 in Romania, as a consequence of the Socialist Republic of Romania's pro-natality policy under Nicolae Ceausescu, anywhere up to 500,000 children became orphans and were institutionalised. They grew up in absolute hellish and restrictive conditions. Rows upon rows of cribs housed the babies and very young children. Caregivers were limited in comparison to the number of children they were overseeing. Extreme neglect was a consequence of this. Also, caregivers rotated, so the babes did not see the same caregivers often. The babes were not able to make the necessary secure attachment with any particular person. On top of this, there was no stimulation. Babes laid in their cribs for literally months and years. That's it. No one was there to comfort them in times of need. No one played with them. No one stimulated their five senses. No one offered them choices. As we talked about in our last video, the five senses we exercise speak to our consciousness. When there is no stimulation of the senses, the consciousness, which should develop between 0 to 6 years, doesn't get awakened properly. It's there with us, but it doesn't awaken properly. Our consciousness has to be awakened with love. it's stimulated to life with love and through play. The consciousness is there, but it stays sleeping because no one has brought the consciousness in that child to awakeness. As I said, that needs to take place in those formative years. This is so important for children. Now, as I've said previously, this can happen to varying degrees. It's not like you're either fully asleep, but maybe somewhat asleep. I will talk about at another time what happens if someone does fall fully asleep. In the Romanian orphanages, caregivers had no time to play with the children. They had no time to stimulate them and bring them to life. They had no time to awaken the babe's consciousness. Play is such an important part of childhood development. Now, think of your religious upbringing. Was God ever seen as loving and easy to approach? Or was he only ever seen as a rules master, a law master who needed to be obeyed or else? So we're going to talk about the importance of playing the game of peekaboo, which may seem strange, but I'm sure you'll get what I'm trying to explain as we go through, right? So no one played peekaboo with these children in Romania. Mum and Dad was absent. Now, in the West, where mums and dads both work and the children grow up in childcare, very often there's still no one to take the time to play peekaboo with that child. Now, caregivers just simply don't have the time to invest in each child's individual developmental needs. Now, nor do they have the love of a parent that each child needs. And I'm not accusing parents of being abusive. And they may have an acceptable level of care. You know, even in the childcare centres, they may have an acceptable level of care, but that's not the love and attention of a parent. Again, the child may not be able to make that secure attachment. Couple that with the fact that on weekends when the child is home, parents who may have worked all week may need their downtime as well and may spend that engaged on social media or in front of the TV or at friends' homes. And the child, who is not necessarily abused and is loved and wanted by the parents, may still experience abandonment and may not recognise it as such because their parents did love them and want them. Unfortunately, society has now developed this way. And as I've said before, that's not an accusation against the parents. It's just the way life is. Let's just deal with the facts. We don't have to finger point. So growing up in a religion may well have been the same because often everything is regimented and controlled. Play may not be considered a good use of time. Spare time may be devoted to religious works or play that is religiously influential. Parents may even believe they're doing the best thing for their children, but their free time may be full of church requirements, and so time to just sit and play with children and just be family may be drastically reduced. Again, choices are restricted. Therefore, free will is restricted. The 5 senses are not being stimulated. The consciousness is not being brought to full life. If it is a very culty, purity-driven and laws and consequences type church or family where TV and screen time is controlled, music, clothes, friends, even school is only Christian school, you know, etc., then it can be worse. God controls everything, you know, because you'll go to hell if you do certain things, especially things that are fun, like video games or going to nightclubs or secular music and friends or whatever. When the Romanian orphanages were discovered by the West, they were quickly dismantled and the babies and young children were adopted to other countries. But luckily, the children were studied and kept an eye on by psychologists. They found many of these babies were robotic in behaviour, and I'm going to talk about that probably in the next video, what that means. It means that their consciousness was sleeping. I'll get to that in the next video. Now, they found that a lot of these babies had a type of quasi-autism. So quasi-autism means that they had difficulties in social communication and social interaction in multiple situations. However, it wasn't necessarily long-lasting. It was observed that when placed with a loving family, these symptoms reverted, but mostly only in the children who were in Romanian care for the shortest periods of times, generally less than 6 months. Empathy and love and play brought these children back to life. It encouraged their consciousness to come out of hiding. Now, quasi-autism can have similar symptoms to true autism, but with quasi-autism, those symptoms or characteristics may not remain. In the right social environment, the symptoms can dissipate. I'll put a link to an article about quasi-autism below if you want to go in and learn about it a bit more. So I also want to put a video. It's a really cute video, but it easily explains the importance of playing peekaboo with a child in its developing years. It's the importance of it in childhood development. I'll stick a link to that below too. It's a very, very cute video, and as I said, really easy to understand. Now, you might not think that these particular things that I'm talking about, like playing peekaboo and what I'm about to talk about, which is attachment trauma, have much to do with divine hiddenness, but that in fact they have everything to do with it, and religious trauma. So attachment trauma is a disruption in the important process of bonding between a baby or child and his or her primary caregiver. And hopefully that would be a parent. But unfortunately, that's not the case for a growing number of this generation because they're growing up in childcare. Now, that trauma may be caused by overt abuse or neglect, or it may be less obvious, such as a lack of affection or response from a caregiver. Neglect comes in all forms. It isn't simply the obvious types. Any form of dismissing our emotions, especially by those who have oversight of us, is neglect. If we are constantly told that we should have faith when we really just need a hug, that is a form of neglect. It's a form of emotional neglect. We learn to stuff our emotions down in order to please God. Otherwise we're displeasing him. A child's early life experiences shape their adult life, and their relationship with their primary caregiver is among the most important for their development. If a child doesn't have their early relational needs met, this can show up in later life in their mental health and in their relationships and sense of self. In religions, God can become the primary caregiver. If he is seen as abusive and uncaring, if he's seen as not being interested in our emotions and does not care about meeting those emotions, if that's what's constantly being told to the child, have faith, have faith, then the relationship between the child and God will be constantly strained and will most likely never connect. This is also closely linked with complex trauma, which is trauma from repeated events such as ongoing emotional abuse or childhood neglect. Now, I posit many who have left the church have experienced complex trauma from religious regulations and ideology that have been imposed without empathy or love. The word love is used often in church, but it's not actualized, it's not experienced. Now, where you will get complex religious trauma, wherever there's an environment of constant stress to behave or be punished, coupled with guilt and shame. So religious rules imposed without love does not produce disciples. It produces atheists. And by atheists, I mean a person who disbelieves or lacks belief in the existence of a deity. Now, I'm not disrespecting atheists. I'm just simply stating that religious rules enforced without love causes unbelief. It's incredible that churches these days, especially those the NAR churches, the Pentecostal charismatic churches, are actually causing unbelief and disconnection from God because of the religious abuse that happens in them. So look, just looking at some overt causes of attachment trauma by caregivers, I'll just mention a few things that the ways in which caregivers can act that cause trauma. So religious leaders that are physically or emotionally unavailable and promote a God who is also seen as emotionally unavailable. Leaders who are unapproachable, inaccessible, too busy. Leaders who sin, pornography, adultery, sexual assault, theft or financial coercion, drugs and alcohol abuse. Leaders who have inherited trauma they haven't processed yet themselves and unknowingly pass that on to their flock. Most church leaders don't understand they're indoctrinated into their particular brand of Christianity. So it's generational indoctrination and religious trauma that they just pass on. So leaders who have poor boundaries, they use abusive, coercive and manipulative methods, including gaslighting. Leaders who sexually abuse. Leaders who use psychological controlling tactics such as not being compassionate, shaming the flock, making the flock feel guilty, or not validating normal human feelings. The fear of hell, the threat of being eternally punished for non-compliance, and leaders who may be controlling, who can remove the flock's power both corporately and individually. So the next little bit I want to look at, and it's really interesting. I'd really like you to go in and look at this video. It doesn't go long at all. I think it's like a minute or 2 minutes. But it's about how toddlers regulate their behaviour to avoid making adults angry. So in the video link below, you'll notice that the child feels happy to play in a safe environment, but when an angry adult walks in, the child no longer wants to play. It becomes withdrawn and frightened. The presence of an angry God will stop us fully expressing our natural desires and exploring our true self. Our choices are diminished and our free will is diminished. So as I said in the video, if you imagine the woman who enters the room as being the angry woman who enters the room, if you imagine her as being an angry God that most religions often present, it's very interesting to see how the child withdraws and won't be free and express itself. I'll also include another video, how unloving parents generate self-hatred. So once again, if you imagine that it's an unloving God that religion presents, and how an unloving God can actually, or our sense of an unloving God can actually generate self-hatred in us. So institutionalisation has a dreadful effect on the development of children. And you may not think that growing up in the church was all that bad. As I said, sometimes it can appear subtle. It may not have seemed quite that horrific. But let me just ask you this question. Then why is it that the deconstruction process is so intense and so prolonged? And if the church was a place designed to help children flourish in life, why are people leaving and unable to identify who they really are and what they truly believe? Why are so many leaving and struggling with faith, and some are leaving without a faith in God at all? So I'll leave that with you for this video to think about, and we'll come back in the next video and start to look at that robotic quasi-autism type of sense of self that we can get in our behaviour if our consciousness goes into hiding. So bless you on your journey until then.